All righty. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Give folks a minute or two here to filter in, but really happy that you could all be here with us today for this panel on creativity in data science and machine learning. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. And so we have three excellent panelists. Really excited for this conversation. So our first panelist is a multidisciplinary artist working across traditional and digital mediums. Trained in painting and printmaking, they also combine writing and code in their work and have hosted poetry open mics at their openings. Instead of portraying the physical form of people and places, they portray the inner layers and dimensions through abstractions. They hold a bachelor's in studio art and human rights from Hampshire College and a master's of data science from the University of San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming Quinn Keck to the panel. Quinn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our second panelist is a generative artist and the author of The Big Sleep Notebook. He originated combining CLIP and VQ-GAN, and his work tends to highlight multimodal image text editing and generation with a focus on text-guided art. He is also a machine learning engineer and researcher at Adobe, where he uses machine learning to edit and create images. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Murdock to the panel today. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And our last panelist is a third-year PhD student from the University of Washington Information School. Her research focuses on computer-supported creative coding for youth and the design of AI literacy tools and resources for families. She is a Weizenbaum Research Fellow and awardee of the NSF Formal Verification in the Field Grant and the Jacobs Foundation Grant. She also designs smart toys and is a speaker and writer. Please join me in welcoming Stefania Druga to the panel. Stefania, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet everyone.
So I do want to let you all know that we are going to save a few minutes at the end of the panel for questions. You can submit questions throughout the panel, either with the chat function, or you actually should have a little questions tab. So we will definitely make time to get to those. If you have a question for a specific panelist or for any of our panelists, feel free to put those in at any time. Also a reminder, we are going to be recording this webinar and having it available on Comet's YouTube channel. So definitely something that you can refer back to. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of really good insight. So let's go ahead and dive in. So I'm curious for all of our panelists, how did your journey into the data science and machine learning field start, and where did you first encounter this creative aspect?
I can start if that sounds good. Okay. So when I was like 16, I started doing like procedural art, where I was like defining rules-based programming. So rules-based programming sets of like images. So like you basically have a random seed, and then you say if it exceeds this threshold or if it has some certain properties, then you display certain things. And I started with the more like traditional generative art of that strain. And then I saw this video. I think it was by like Daniel Schiffman on neural networks, and he started with one layer, like single neuron neural networks, or artificial neural networks to be more specific. And after learning about like how you could provide data to define, to more loosely define what you want to see in an image, I got really interested in that and have been just doing art with data and art with code ever since. And yeah, so for me, it was starting as an art practice and then like continuing to develop eventually into my career.
Awesome. I can go next or whichever works. Yeah, so I started out a little bit differently for sure. I think I was in like very traditional art practices, and then I actually like worked in like nonprofits right out of undergrad, and then got into like data science just by kind of being in these like direct service roles and realizing I really wanted to like zoom out and see the bigger picture. And I was just seeing like little pieces of the puzzle and was really excited about like the data for good movement and all that kind of stuff. And then once I was in data science, I reconnected. Like I think I'd always loved the creative aspect of math. Like when I took like calculus, I loved making like all the graphs like all the time. Like that's like pretty much what I did in calculus class and stuff. And then I think while I was like learning data science, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much creative potential. This is so cool to be able to generate art and stuff like that, and really got started getting involved in this world.
I can go next. I think for me, it all started with hardware actually, because I started prototyping and programming hardware with Arduino projects, like making different interactive demos and then teaching kids how to do it. And then realizing, oh, we're actually collecting data from the sensors or the robots or the cameras we're using. How are we going to analyze that? And I think the machine learning creative piece really started back in 2016, 2017, when I was at Media Lab, and I realized, oh my God, we have this voice assistants and all sorts of different applications of AI that are becoming part of the home and part of children's lives. but they don't necessarily are given the tools to be creative with them or make their own applications or imagine their own like games. And it felt like a lot of the approaches of introducing kids to machine learning, data science were very much driven by adult world, whereas like, how can we optimize like make self-driving cars? And kids don't care about that. They think driving a car is fun, right? So it's like, what are other applications that are creative and fun for families, for kids? And that's when I started working in the space, build a platform called Cognimates that would allow actually non-technical users to train easily their own models and then build interactive applications with it, with these custom models that they make. But I think there's definitely a blue sky and so much more to explore in terms of what is it unique about this medium of creating with AI, creating with ML that we weren't able to do before in the creative coding space and creative learning space.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a lot of advancement in the last few years for sure. And of course, in kind of the data science and machine learning world, it is an industry where end product is everything, where you're building models to serve a purpose and you're doing things to bring business value. So how do you either balance work and your kind of personal creations, or have you been able to find a way to overlap them and create a creative job in this specific data industry?
So for me, I went to school to study psychology, and I was like partway through a PhD when I started doing this work with like text to image systems, and like I realized that like every day I was ending classes and like just doing art for the rest of the day. So I realized, oh, I should probably figure out a way to make this as much a part of my like career and my life as I can, because I just enjoy it so much. So for me, it's like the latter option that you talked about, where it's like an overlap, and because obviously there needs to be a balance between things like your social life and your personal life. But I feel like for me, I've been really lucky in being able to be like, okay, I'll work on these kinds of things in my day job, and I thought that would be like an issue and that I like might stop enjoying it. That was like a big worry of mine, but I found that like sometimes I'll be like tuning parameters for a model and I'll be like, this is too much. I need to like actually make art for a little bit. But I found that, yeah, like being able to overlap them and synthesize what I like about the job and what I like about like my art practice has been something I felt really fortunate to be able to do. So yeah, for me it's all about, and I know that for a lot of people get to do this, but for me it's like finding what I like in my job and like focusing on that and trying to integrate it into my practice as much as possible.
Can go next to break the order. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question because I wore many hats before being a grad student. As a community organizer or an NGO co-founder, right? It was very hard for me to separate like, oh, what's work and what's fun and because I really enjoy what I did and it never felt like work. So I could say when I was building Hackademia and doing workshops on technology learning and creative learning with technology for kids around the world, like every aspect of my work was creative. In terms of research and what I'm doing as part of the grad school, there is the freedom for me to choose what I want to research and how I go about researching it, and that's one part that I really like. Then it becomes more tricky to give legitimacy to this approach. Like whenever I go to pick any academic community focused on, let's say, IDC, interaction design for children, or computer-human interaction, or let's say just learning science conferences or machine learning conferences. And I interact with all of these different communities, and every time I need to convince them on different aspects of creative learning or creative expression with AI, because everyone is seeing it through their angle. Like for the learning people, it's like, why is this learning? How do we evaluate it? How do we measure it, right? For the, let's say, more like creativity conference, like there's this specific like ACM conference, then it's, oh, why would you create with AI? What is new about this? And how does this build on what we've done before? And then AI ML conferences is like, why do you want to do this? This is not useful, right? It doesn't make money. So it's really interesting to approach this from a more interdisciplinary and thinking, like, how do we build bridges and actually inspire people to contribute their lived experiences and also their expertise to this new domain. I definitely see myself playing a role there. And more particularly, I'm doing an internship right now where I am primarily focusing on large language models and how they can be used for new applications. And I'm trying to push the creative angle in basically saying we shouldn't solve everything for developers. Like, how can we not condition what they do and how they do it, but still support them, which is a very tricky approach or question to answer. But yeah, I think it's more like a mode of life where it's like remembering the inner child and to play and have fun, and that kind of breeds into the work and the people that get attracted to the work and collaboration and so on.
Awesome. Yeah, I think currently I have very much like work art divide, but maybe someday that'll be different. And like my data science work, I'm more just doing like forecasting models. And while I do think there's like far more of an art to machine learning than I ever imagined when I was like switching fields, like I think I had in my mind there would just be like this really objective truth, and I'd like crunch some numbers and it'd be magical. We wouldn't have any like, how do we collect the data? Who's collecting the data? How do we use the data? Like all those kind of problems, which definitely I think is more of an art form. And yeah, like it, and I think that kind of like thought process really relates like a lot to like my artistic practice or any like artistic practice of just like it's not clear cut and stuff. But yeah, like I think yeah, like my main like work is a lot of forecasting models, so that's not could you like I might make a graph or something, but very different than the work I'm like excited about like in my off time. So definitely balance is hard, but I think the like the skill sets like always like carry over, and there's always yeah like I think thinking about, I don't know, sometimes I just need a break from projects. So I like the duality of getting focused in one world and then switch.
Yeah, that's great. That balance is so key. I think especially with creativity, you have to nurture and you can't always force it. It's not always going to meet a timeline. So I'm interested, maybe Quinn, we can start with you because you do your more of your artistic work on the side. It's not a full-time job. How do you find inspiration? What prompts you to start a new project? And then I'd love to hear too from folks who have this a little more directed and potentially with kind of work and research. But Quinn, let's start with you. I know it's $1 million question for artists.
Totally. Yeah, so I think that a lot of the inspiration of my work like comes through my life. And like my like latest project I made was made like mid quarantine, and I think I was like getting to the point where I was like sick of Zoom, wanting to connect with people, and also feeling like really like a lot of people just isolated. It's a whole world to navigate and stuff. So I was really excited about the idea of participatory art, and then how could I interact with a viewer in that way versus just like having something on a wall and like them seeing it. So that from that, then I was like, oh, I've also just been like really interested in like how computers interpret things and like how the algorithms are running wild everywhere, and talking about like computer vision. And I just feel like when I'm talking to like my like friends in like the art community or like the outside the non-data science community, like their just minds are blown, and my mind was also blown when I was like transitioning and being like, what? This is how the world works. So I think I was like really excited about like exploring those concepts, and then came up with a project that in some ways talked about that. And I think that's true for a lot of my sort of like artistic practices. I'll just I think read something, see something, also be excited about what other people are doing. I think it's really cool that there is like an art and tech community, and we can like all learn from each other and build off that. So sometimes I'll be like, oh my god, I didn't even ever think of it, especially like with glitch work. Like I like when I first saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's so cool. Like how like those generate things from mistakes. Like that has so many like interesting like thought processes and philosophical things to talk about. So I guess that was a long answer, but maybe the short version would be like from what's going on in life, like whether the world or what I'm seeing and stuff, and then thinking about how I might want to translate that to an art project.
Awesome. Ryan or Stefania, do you want to jump in? I know some of it might be you're inspired because it's your job or it's because you have a deadline coming up, but would love to hear your process and what sort of gets you thinking on a new project.
I like to keep in touch with communities that really fuel my creativity juices and inspire me. The School of Poetic Computation is one of those communities. There's this IO festival. The School of Make Belief and Machines in Berlin is another one. So throughout the years, I discovered a series of communities of people who are living and breathing in the space. And then there's the live coding algorithm community. So whenever I feel like, oh, I'm getting like stuck in a local minima of academia or I don't know, industry or whatever, I always try to go back like ITP camp or anything like from online webinars like this one, or maybe like a weekend hackathon, or maybe a shorter like workshop. And it's a way to keep myself in check, that like I still have things to contribute or inspire people, but also to make sure that I get new ideas, new inspiration, and refresh my energy in that space.
Yeah, for me, it's similar to the other panelists, I think, in a lot of ways, where sometimes it's just something from my life, and sometimes it's from like the communities or like scenes online that I'm in. I also think that like sometimes it'll be like I'll read something in a book or like some literature or something, and I'll be like, okay, I have to like try this quote with a text to image model because it's just so cool or so interesting or seems profound. But one thing that I think I've found, especially with text to image, is that because you can run like a phrase and get like an infinite number of like different potential like image reference for a phrase, for me, I sometimes can draw inspiration from the model itself, because like for instance with Clip, like it's seen millions and millions of images. Sometimes I feel like I'll get into kind of a groove and be able to say, okay, I'm going to generate an image, and then based on what I think of that image or what it evokes for me, I'll generate a new image, and so on and so forth. And one thing that I really like about like data science art and machine learning art is like sometimes to some degree it can feel a little bit like a collaboration between like me and the systems that I'm working with, so that I like, even when I'm not really inspired, I feel like I can plug something in that isn't inspired and either get like a bad result that makes me think of something else, or get something that just happens to look better than I expected.
Yeah, always fun when something that maybe potentially goes wrong actually inspires a lot of other great work. I think that's a pretty standard experience for a lot of artists. So one thing that's come up with the rise of generative art and with this sort of live coding, obviously we're always expanding the definition of art. We've all moved on from high Renaissance, these Italian guys sitting there painting all of these huge paintings. But I'm curious for you, do you carry around a sort of personal definition of art? We talked about community. Have you found that some people are a little more restrictive with what is considered art, especially in terms of using machines, using algorithms? Or have you found that it's been pretty open, or potentially a kind of 50?
So for me, it's interesting because like before a couple of years ago, or potentially you could maybe argue even like 1.5 years ago, people didn't think of like text to image as like a medium. And I think that at this point, with the advent of things like Dolly and Clip and the kind of like hacker scene that kind of preceded Dolly 2 being released, I think that it's become a little bit more common for people to be open to the idea of like text to image as a valid medium. But a lot of people that I've talked to who are like art historians or who are like in the more traditional art world will be like, okay, this is with the advent of collaborating with machines. This is like when the camera came out, people were all like, oh, this is the death of portraiture. This is such a terrible thing. No one's making anything new with it. They're just capturing reality. And I think that there's a similar attitude in general towards like code art from some people. I think that there's a lot of openness in some communities, but when we're in like the other panelists have mentioned, this really cross-disciplinary like cognitive science, data science, machine learning, psychology, traditional art world, like when we're straddling all of these different communities, there are always going to be people who like have a like very restrictive view of what art is or what it should be. So I found that there is like a really disruptive, some people would even say destructive, but a disruptive aspect to like, the way that you can say this is a new technology that is being used and that some people don't think is art yet. But I think that in a decade or a couple of years, it'll be pretty accepted that collaborate or guide a machine towards making art. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that I feel like I've seen more pushback than I initially expected to the idea that you could make art with data science and with machine learning. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to see what people define art as and what it should be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we had a few examples of artists that really had breakthroughs in the space and that changed a little bit the narrative. I'm thinking of Mario, I think it's Kilgerman. I don't want to mispronounce his last name, but he was doing like this generative, like neural network art. Some of the pieces got sold, auctions for significant amounts, and then that drew a lot of attention. Then we see, I don't even know if I want to mention this term because it's going to open a can of worms, but NFTs, right? Like what's happening in that space. I think it's interesting that there were some examples of artifacts that were not only created but also appreciated in the art world. And by appreciate, like there were people who were willing to spend a significant amount of money to actually put this in, not in their home, but on their screen. I think that really pushed like the envelope. And in terms of how that reflects in the communities I work with or my work, like for me, it's all about creative coding. Like, how do I get kids to be creative by writing code? So yeah, maybe sometimes they would create visualizations, other times it's just games, other times it's like sound programs, or so there are different mediums. But there is like a big pushback in terms of how much the computer helps and how much the kids do it, or adults. Where do you draw the line? Is it just like a creativity support, or is it really a partnership? And then if it's a partnership, then there are these open questions in terms of ownership and copyright. And, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the US Copyright Office just ruled that works that are autonomously generated by algorithms cannot be copyrighted. And the examples of work that they rejected, surprising in terms of artifact nature. And as far as I'm concerned, like I took a stance of focusing on self-directed creativity and self-efficacy, trying to have these debates of what is creative work in the space of coding with kids, or how do we measure if this program is creative and this program is not creative. I actually focus more on the kids and how they describe that they're able to express their ideas, like where they're able to express their ideas more fluently in ways like that they had this vision for a program and they were able to manifest it in its entirety or not. And so that doesn't require me or any other outside evaluators to come in and say, this is creative, this is not. But it becomes more personal expression and like a question of how do we create tools and mediums and support the practice for users, in my case kids, to actually be able to express their visions more fluently and in ways that they consider to be expressive. So that's been my workaround to say, look, we don't need to agree on what's creative in the space, but we should ask the people who are doing the work if they think that the work is what they want it to be, that it's evolving, that it's fun, that it's an accurate representation of their vision.
Awesome. Yeah, I think both you all, those were great answers, and I really echo a lot of that. Like, I think, yeah, like there's all kinds of definitions of art out there, and I've also experienced like that kind of pushback of, oh, you made it with the machine, or you didn't draw it, or you didn't like hand paint every little thing. Or I'll even do a lot of make digital images and then like paint on top of them, and people are like, that's cheating. Like you can't like you didn't like paint like every layer or something. And yeah, I think I tend more towards, I'm not like working with kids, but like a personal definition of if somebody in the world like created something and felt creative out of that and got some idea out, then I would call that art. And I don't think it doesn't need to be ever seen by anybody else or validated by like a gallery or the art world or someone buying it and stuff. And then if that's the basis, then the art, I don't know, world or whatever, people can debate this till the end of time and stuff. But I do think, yeah, I'm excited to see like what the next 10 years will be of like as like coding art gets more accepted by that world, how that'll change people's perceptions of everything. Because I definitely even felt 10 years ago, like when I was in undergrad, like art was very much a like this like process of like you learn to paint realistically and then eventually you'll rebel and then you'll paint like abstractly, but it's still just it was very locked into the medium and that kind of thing. And now I think in this like world, like what is even a medium anymore? We're all using so many different things, and do we need to, is it important to categorize it? What is there a level of something as a painting or a print or a digital creation or anything? And maybe it's more about like the idea or what it meant to the person who made it.
Yeah, I really like the point that like sometimes art isn't about, like we alluded to in some of the previous questions, it's not always about the final product, and it's not always about like selling it and having it in a gallery. It can be more process driven, and it can be more about a transformative or like useful process for the artist instead of being like, okay, what's the artifact and what do we classify it as and all of that. So I do think there's something to be said of some people get like really into the weeds about defining and labeling what things are and having a taxonomy of art when it's like we could be making art instead and experiencing, enjoying it. So I think that those are both really good answers in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it definitely speaks to increasing accessibility for folks to be creative and to learn how to code at a young age and learn how to express themselves in a completely different way than, I think any of us were taught. Most certainly not an option when I was growing up. And we've alluded to, obviously, like text to image art is really popular right now. We've seen a couple apps rise up. Folks who are not in the machine learning or data science space have encountered it and gotten a taste. I'm curious if you have any guesses for what kind of the next big thing in generative art or what this kind of creative coding industry is going to look like in the next few years. Yeah, that's the big one.
I think it's a good question to be like looking ahead and saying, what do we anticipate? I think that the most boring answer I could think of would be like text to video, but I think that one thing that we see a lot of now is we've gotten to the point where you can, using natural language, generate something that's like what you wanted to some degree. And like Facebook even put out something where you could like define the scene basically and have, this is where I want the dog, this is where I want orange or whatever you want. So I think that for me, one thing that I've been thinking about is now we can get what we want out of a generative model when it comes to text to image pretty well. So one thing that I've been thinking about in the back of my head, because I'm still working on text to image stuff, but in the back of my head, I'm like, so we can get what we want from these generative models, but we still don't have a good way of, there's still this missing piece of what do we want from them. And I would like to work on systems that can generate like aesthetically pleasing or interesting content, not autonomously, because like I don't think there's not going to be a robot or thing that's a first mover where it's not based off of like the creator or things like that. But I would like to think about systems where it's, instead of saying, okay, I want this really interesting image that has this composition with these things in it, I'd like to think about ways of getting people what they want without them even knowing exactly what they want. So, and in that way, I think it's interesting because it cuts out me as an artist in some ways. So you become like a meta artist. Like I don't even like using the word meta anymore, but like you get to this point where you're like trying to figure out a way, and this is in code art too in some ways, where like you're trying to create something that can, without very much guidance, create something that's interesting without having to like necessarily specify many parameters for that. One thing that I think is next is, instead of getting people what they want, getting things that people want without having to specify and without having the artifact that they want to generate as like a given, which for me raises weird questions about where's the creation in that. Is that actually art? But that's where I see things moving once text to image is more widely adopted.
I was thinking about it from this question of sharing artifacts or sharing process or sharing tools, and what are the communities for those? Because if I'm looking at what exists right now, we see things like Runaway ML, which is like this code-free tool where anyone can experiment with machine learning models in creative ways. It's curated, so there's a lot of curated experiences and processes there, but people can also share like how they change like their GAN, or like how they combine a GAN with text to image, or have this kind of chains of different models and prompts that are given to different models. And then there are things like that, all the demos that people have done either with processing or ML5. So it feels like there's a series of niche communities. They're quite niche still. And I'm wondering, if we're talking like 10 years from now, what's going to be the community of artists with AI, and how do they share their artifacts? Are those remixable, right? Like, how do they share their processes, or how do they engage with each other? Because if I think about communities like DeviantArt or like other communities that currently exist in the space of design and art, there's a big part of building a portfolio, sharing artifacts, allowing people to modify and build upon those. So the easier we make it for people to collaborate, remix, have this evolution, right? Like in biology, of all of these different approaches and artifacts at scale, like I think we'll see many more interesting results. And that's what I would like to see. I think right now, the tricky thing, I've done a survey, for example, of all resources that exist for teaching AI to people. And it's really either like very specific singular demos or like much more curated step-by-step curriculum, which are not free and hard to get to. But there isn't like this in between of like low entry point, wide walls, people build lots of different things, and also opportunity for high ceilings. So if you really want to go far with an exploration, you can. And if I think of communities like Scratch, which largest community of kids coding online, like that's exactly why they became so successful, because they had this low floor, wide walls, high ceilings. So the question for me for future of creativity and art with AI is going to be like, what does that community look like, and how do we enable people to more easily share their works and their processes so they are remixable?
Yeah, I think initially I'd automatically, similar to Ryan, like gone to moving images, or we can generate NLPs that like make a whole story, so it'll just make it longer somehow, and the sequence of connected. And then I was also, I think, thinking about like how people get in, and just like how what a small percent of the world like actually even knows to code, and like the levels. And I feel like I'm still learning like a ton every day of what's going on. And I think, yeah, if there was some kind of breakthrough or like ways to make coding, especially this level of things, like accessible to people. Like I remember when I was first studying to code, there was like this visual toolbox, and I could build like really base coding, and that was like really helpful. But as far as I know, there isn't like a super great like version of that for anything like we're approaching like machine learning and that kind of stuff. So I think hopefully, or I would be excited for the next big step is just making those kind of things like more accessible. And I think that would also like just enhance learning in general. Like people learn lots of different like modalities, and having different ways of writing code and getting their work out there. Or even I think I've heard of like coding in like natural language being like maybe like the next thing of you don't even have to know code, like there's some kind of translation and stuff. And I think that would be really exciting just to get more people able to do it and expand kind of their horizons.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's, like you both touched on, one thing that's really missing right now is you'll have these like collab notebooks or these like random Jupyter notebooks floating around, but there's this huge issue like in the text to image community of like, how are we going to keep track of all this? Because there are like these lists that just stretch pages and pages of people's projects, but it's like, there's not a good, especially for people who are like not really deep into machine learning or really deep into data science. It's like, how do they get started? How do they get into it? How do they get involved? And how do they know like where to start? So I definitely think that making it easier for wider access to these tools that like can sometimes make art more accessible. Like there are instances where I know this person who has problems using their arms to like paint, so they use text to image as their like main medium. So I think that making it easier for just people in general to access tools. Sorry, speaking of work-life balance, I think that making it easier for people to access tools that make it easier to make art is like really important, and just like making sure that it's not a small percentage of the world being able to access and use these tools and build on them is definitely a really like noble pursuit.
Absolutely. And I think you've all touched on this. For folks that are just getting started, there is this need for community and there is this ever-present collaboration in the creative industry. But do you have any specific like tools or bits of advice for folks who want to start trying out creative coding, or who want to potentially dip a toe in generative art and sort of take on a more creative aspect to their practice? Any tips or blogs or anything that you could point to that would be a good place for people just start?
If it's possible, if it exists, I've really found like, at least for me in my learning, like taking a workshop where like people are there and there's someone there. Because I don't know, especially even sometimes when I read people's like notebooks, this makes sense, but I didn't write this. And so it's just such a huge help, especially if you're starting out, to just have the person who made this process there. I know, like a few art and tech orgs, they'll have like a machine learning or generative art thing, and you can just run it. And you are still probably, especially if it's a short workshop, like learning like that one specific notebook or skill, but at least you have like the ability to like talk with the person who made it and learn more, and like also just see all the range of things people in the workshop might make. So definitely, if you can make it to a workshop, that would be my big advice.
I second the workshop advice. I think it's so much easier to get into it when surrounded by other people and immerse yourself, be able to ask questions and so on. I've been to a few workshops that Gene Kogan has done. He also is writing like this ongoing book. I sent the link to the organizers chat, so maybe Emilie, you can help me relay it. So he's been curating examples of notebooks, demos, collabs, and it's not only Gene, but he's created this space where other people can contribute as well. But I think this is a great place to start. It's maintained since 2016. Lots of great classes, fundamentals, textbook, models, step-by-step examples. Yeah, I think the other on GitHub, as Ryan mentioned, there are so many repos with long lists. Generative art and ML. NeurIPS has every year a different workshop, which is like how do we use neural networks for art. And I try to go to that every year and follow, like I mentioned before, School of Poetic Computation is also a great place to do these workshops. It is ongoing and evolving space. If people want to just learn more about AI in order to think like, how do I create with AI? I found that the work from Jeremy Howard, who started Kaggle competition on fast AI, to be the easiest way to get started with machine learning for people who have not used or weren't exposed to any of the concepts before. Yeah, I think this would be my go-tos for now.
Yeah, I would totally second that. Gene Kogan is super great, does a lot of really cool work, and definitely makes a good community and a good way of like jumping into machine learning for art. There are a lot of people who do like good intros. So another person who has a similar role to Gene Kogan is this person on Twitter named Derek has started yet another project. That's their username, which is a long username. But they have a YouTube channel where they'll just kind of like demo, and a Patreon where they'll just demo things like Stalgan. And they even have like really like fundamental tutorials like how to use the command line and things like that. So I like their work a lot. But one piece of advice that I've always thought is good is find a project. And part of the hard thing is like knowing which project to start on, but like finding a project that maybe like builds on what you already know, which again, if you're just starting is like a really hard thing to do, but like starting with a project and saying, okay, this is something that I want to do or something that I want to modify that someone else has done can be really helpful, because then you're not just like, I think that for me, at least in my experience, I was always like, okay, here's something I've seen someone do or something I'd like to do, and I'm gonna try and either move what they've done just like one step further and try to replicate it, or try to complete this project. And so I think that being like really driven in terms of like projects instead of classes has been something that's been useful for me. Although I know that a lot of people find that like having a Coursera or something is useful, but I definitely think that like workshops and projects and like having a community around you are definitely super good. Like I haven't gone to many workshops because a lot of the time that I've been like most active in the machine learning scene has been like COVID times. But I think that actually having like mentorship there and like having people who can introduce you to these things is super good, and having a community like ML4A is not just like really useful, but also makes the process a lot more enjoyable and like fulfilling.
Awesome. Yeah, all great resources. So I know we're coming up on the last few minutes here. I definitely want to be cognizant of the time. Don't want to take up any more of anyone's day. But if anyone in the audience has any questions, yeah, feel free to put them either in the chat or you have a question feature. So one thing I did want to ask while I have all of you here, I'm a fan of everyone's work. I always find it fascinating to look at, especially someone who's not technical, but who does have a more traditional art background. But I'm curious, what has been either your favorite piece or your favorite project that you've worked on in this kind of creative aspect of your careers?
I can go first. I don't know if it's like my favorite piece, but it was the first thing that came to mind. We did this installation, Alice in Wonderland, and it was the first demo of Cognimates, which is the platform I built for its visual blocks, but it has 18 extension for different cognitive services or hardware, all sorts of other plugins that could be linked together. And we built this installation called Alice in Wonderland, where it was like an entire room, very whimsical. There were bubble machines and color lights that are programmable and things that were rotating. We laser cutted like all of these pieces that looked like they were coming from Alice's dreams, like the rabbits. And the idea was that people would enter the room and describe like what they dreamt or what their latest dream was, and the entire room would start reacting to their dream. So if it was a dream that sounded more like a nightmare, like the way the pieces would move and the shadows would be pretty scary, and then the sound would start, it was pretty scary too, and the colors were red. And if they were like describing a dream that was more like nice dream, the bubble machines would start and the colors were friendly and so on. So very simple, but it was extremely engaging and immersive. And what was nice is that people could keep on adding pieces. So it's, oh, like if I don't have a bubble machine, maybe I'll add another, I don't know, have a robot that I have, and it will start to dance because you're describing something that is funny or not. But I like how people were engaging with it, and they kept describing dreams over and over, and it was just very whimsical, like the way they would play like with all the elements in the room. And the best part was I was showing them the code and it was readable and they understood exactly like how to change it and what worked. So I think I liked that I was able to do an immersive experience that was also read and write for people. Like it would be very easy for them to pick it up and modify it and change it to their liking.
Yeah, that sounded amazing. Or just describing it. I think, yeah, probably the one I'd be the favorite to find was the participatory project I was mentioning earlier. Yeah, like I think that was really excited and something I'd been wanting to try to figure out just like in art in general. Like I think I felt like in undergrad I got a lot of, you're just supposed to lock yourself in a studio and be sad and paint, but it'll be like genius and then the world will be fine with it or something and it'll be worth it. And I think really discovering like artistic community has been like huge because it doesn't have to be like that and you don't have to, this like suffering artist thing doesn't have to be like the paradigm you're living your life in. So yeah, I think, yeah, like for that project, it was just like people would fill out a short survey and then I had like code that like I had actually like labeled my abstract art images. And so then based on kind of those like image labels, it wasn't like the fanciest thing, but just like those would match and then they would generate like a composite image. And then I did a bunch of combining those. So then it was kind of like this like almost like visual conversation. And yeah, like the survey was like very like whimsical. It was just like life is, and then you pick a noun and none of them really make sense like questions, but it was, I don't know, I think especially I just enjoyed people's even like excitement about the survey. They being like, this is great, yeah, life is a petri dish. And I'm like, yes, we're all in quarantine and life is definitely like a petri dish right now or whatever and stuff. And also just, yeah, getting people's like responses and then having different ways of combining them, like not just like interacting with people, but then the visual thing was really fun. So yeah, that was probably like the one I was most favorite about.
Yeah, I think that in terms of my favorite projects, there are a lot of projects that I've done that I've like really enjoyed, but going along the lines of like more interactive work, I don't know, I would only say it's like loosely art, but I worked on this one project where it was like the early days of when like this text to image or this model that can connect images and text and then be used for text to image was released called Clip. To give a little bit of background, and I figured out that you could hook it up to generative models and steer them to produce images from text. And my initial notebooks that I like put out for it produced like really ugly stuff, and it was like okay text to image, but it was like aesthetically just so awful to look at a lot of the time. But I finally found this generative model called VQGAN that works as a really good prior. It basically, instead of producing images when guided by Clip that were like really hazy or really just like I had a previous notebook where it produced dogs like half the time because the generative model was Big GAN. And Big GAN is trained on a lot of dogs just because that's the makeup of ImageNet, like some arbitrary reason. And so anyways, with VQGAN and Clip, it was fun because I finally felt like I was making something that like people could interact with this artifact that I've created. And not only that, but could also improve the artifact. Like there have been many implementations of VQA and Clip since, but like I actually never ended up releasing my code. It was all like private to this Patreon. But being able to put out something that I felt like people could interact with to create their own art with, and that people could even interact with to create new things for people to make their own art with was like really compelling to me because it felt like I was helping people out. And like I mentioned before, having a meta artistic task of like letting people use this notebook to create their own work and having this kind of like ancestry where I could see like people doing some really creative things that I never would have anticipated with the notebook and being like, okay, even though this isn't my art in any way, the things that they create, like I could feel like, oh, I've contributed to that in some loose kind of way. And yeah, that notebook, it was called like late envisions, and it was like a year ago-ish, but that was probably my favorite project to date.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely everyone who is watching, check out all of these projects. They're all amazing. Really awesome work. We are coming up on time. I don't have any audience questions, but I could have this conversation all day long, but we'll end it here. Thank you again so much to all of our panelists for joining us today for a fantastic conversation. Thank you to our audience. And again, we're going to have this recording available to everyone. We'll definitely hope that you can share it and that you found a lot out of this. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good day.